Good afternoon, friends. Um, when I was preparing this presentation, I was actually hesitant whether I should do this in this particular session. But hearing last 2 days, yesterday and today, I'm a little emboldened about talking about the issues that I'm going to talk about. So I'm not going to present any overarching view of the current situation of land governance. I'm not going to present any set of research results. What I'm going to present essentially is a proposal for us to think about. I named it the topic as asking the very fundamental question: why at all govern land? Is it something that without it life cannot go on? Or is it something that the modernity has discovered? Why is it that we have to govern land? I surnamed it as long view of governance. The long view means a long view of the past, as well as trying to make an attempt of a long view of the future. Typically, when we ask what is governance, people reply saying that, okay, it is, in the modern sense, it is the exercise of the state, exercise of the authority of the state to achieve certain developmental goals, certain regulatory goals, certain national security goals, certain other cultural goals, certain other moral goals, etc., etc. And you will see hundreds of educational programs, you will see dozens of professional training programs on governance that deal with this modern sense where state is the most important and most vital actor in how we conceive governance. So when I take a longer, and then there are land governance frameworks. One of those are the dominant frameworks is the LGAF, the Land Governance Framework of the World Bank, which deals with 9 different parameters to look at land governance, right from tenure security to registration valuation to land records management to land dispute settlements, and etc., etc. The question that I want to ask and I want to deal with in this short attempt is the question about why at all govern land and who governs whose lands and why. Now, I want to begin that by a slightly apparently tangent looking proposition, but I'll try to show the connection between what I'm going to talking about and what is this about. Now, there's a generally growing global concern, and the global concern is something like a cognitive crisis, which is that in the age of Anthropocene, human actions are changing the earth systems. Human actions of any kind, a cigarette we smoke, or a refrigerator we use, or even the bottled drinking water, or the fertilizer, or the pesticides, or the urban way of life, the pollution, everything. It's changing the entire Earth's ecosystem for about 10,000 to 100,000 years. That's called the geological time scale. Whereas that is happening, human faculty is not able to think beyond 50 years. And there's been lots of studies to show, depends on who you ask, human faculty's thinking horizon. If you ask corporate leaders of Google and Amazon, they are thinking about 50 years. Because beyond that, they don't know even the corporate model will work or not. If you ask politicians globally, not only in India, globally politicians are not able to think beyond 10 years. If you ask a bureaucrat, depends on which government the bureaucrat is working. The average is again 5 to 10 years. If you ask a banker, well, 20 years maybe, 25 years. Now that is where I'm looking forward to having something to talk about the long view of governance. Are we in a position today that we were changing the world in which we don't know what we are doing? Now, I start with, again, I said that I'll start with a long view. So, at a long view of the past, I start with 10,000 BC. The 10,000 BC is kind of roughly the time when agriculture started getting settled agriculture. Agriculture was known before, but what we know as settled agriculture today has started getting formed around. The times are a little hazy those days, because some people would claim 12,000 years, some people will say 10,000 BC, but roughly 10,000 BC. And with the settled agriculture, something to govern about land started cropping in. There are evidence and there are studies to show that some rules of governance of land started coming in because people started living in settlements. People started living in settlements intergenerationally, not only for a period of a season or for a period of a year, but they started living as settled agriculture happened, settled villages started happening. Now, from that period to roughly about the beginning of the empires, and the first known empire is the Akkadian Empire of Sargon, somewhere in Mesopotamia. This entire period of 16,000 years, the primary objective of governing land was people who were governing their own land for essentially continuation of the clan or the tribe intergenerationally, trying to settle whatever little disputes that would have happened between you have to also see the history of family. The families were also started getting settled, monogamies were coming in. Obviously, the different kinds of conflicts started having on these resources on land. So some rules about governing of that. I'm using this word Vamsha, which is actually, I've taken a liberty to take a little longer beyond, because Vamsha is a word found in Rig Veda, and Rig Veda is slightly later. But Vamsha is a first kind of rules that were found to govern the land intergenerationally and to reduce intrafamily conflicts. So essentially, for nearly 16,000 years, land was getting governed by very small settlement. What are the number of people we are talking about in a settlement? The known figures are around 75 to 150. Those are the kind of small settlements. And you have then, as empires grew, or even before the empires, the word in India came to be known as Janapads. And then there was a later name called Mahajanapads. And then we had started also the empires. And the second is another very long period, again, 4000 BC to 1800s, where not only in India, but many parts of the world saw emergence of empires. And there's another word known to the empire, which is called dynasty. There's some difference between this, but mostly they were the same. Some empires were really big as they grew, but some empires were very small. I mean, for example, the very well-known Aztec empires in Mexico is actually half the Mexico today. That was their span. But if you look at Ottoman Empire, that was now having 3 continents almost. So these empires were, and this is a whole period when the primary intention of why govern land was only one, that is collection of tax or rent to sustain the empire's aristocracy and army. As empire grew, the requirement for standing army grew. And we know this, Roman empires Roman Empire, means the first, the second, and the later ones, had a standing army of more than 100,000 people, 100,000 plus people. Mughal empires have, in certain periods of time, 50,000 to 150,000 kind of size of army, and then huge aristocracy. As the need for tax and rent increased, the need for demarcation, need for boundaries. Now, these are things that we deal with every day now. Need for classifications, because then people at some point in the empires realized, and these days, huge research and books have come out for nearly 130 different empires about the land's context in those, and ownerships, different kinds of ownerships, transaction rules, decrees, documents, tax collectors, various kinds of tax collectors in various kinds of countries, and all these evolved. So it's not that the measurements, boundaries, documents, land records are invention of modernity. Those were there, not in all empires, but in the later empires, those were there. But those were not the way, many of those were not as accurate, as precise, as visible and identifiable as we are dealing with today. I want to talk about the word land reform. The reason I mentioned this is that land reform is something which is again an invention of modernity. But the earliest land reform, an attempt of land reform, happened as far back as 133 BC. There is a famous land reform attempt was done in the Roman Empire because the aristocracy was looting the ordinary people's land, where the males were recruited in the Roman Emperor's army and they were moving out of those villages and settlements. The aristocracy was expanding their loot. And in 133 BC, in the Roman Empire's cabinet, there was a gentleman called Gracchus and his brother, who was also part of the cabinet. And they said that there has to be a land reform, otherwise Roman Empire will collapse. And they devised an entire land reform. They actually formed a land reform commission. The Latin word, if you translate to English, it's land reform commission. And they devised a land reform measures in which they said, and you will be all delighted to know this, that every Roman should have a minimum land of 330 acres. You can imagine why, because the population was of that scale. The sad part of it is that even though the Senate approved it, there were members in the Senate who murdered these Gracchus. Gracchus was killed. And so the reform actually didn't take place, even after it's just started. Now, we come to the third phase. And this is the phase that we, approximately 1750s to now, we are continuing. And here, interestingly, we have both land means surface as well as beneath the surface. And in even more modern context, water. So I didn't mention water, but I should have mentioned water. The driving principle or the philosophy of land governance in the modern times is securing private property for essentially growth, rising income, investments, transactions, acquisitions. So the governance rules and the entire gamut of the infrastructure and the architecture of governance has formed for last 300 years, has got refined in almost every country for last 300 years, essentially to see that private property is secured. And you have all the philosophies from John Locke to now there are other peoples who critiqued. Later on, you have Polanyi's famous work on, and these things we teach our students in the academia, so we're quite familiar with this. And then later on, in very, very late modern times, we are started talking about the poverty as well as women's land rights. Now, all those also got added into the discourse because we still believe, after 300 years, that we have to secure private property because private property can then lead to individual creativity, individual excellence, individual freedom, and then that will reduce, that will generate growth, that will generate production, that will generate market. And the entire mechanism for doing that is a setup and architecture of governance in which we have all the intricacies from satellite mapping to GIS instruments mapping to the digitization of land records to the ease of the laws, entire judicial system so that we can, any claim can be easily settled. And unfortunately, those are realities because most of the pending court cases in India are essentially land disputes. And many of those land disputes turn into a law and order issue because they turn into a fight between the brothers or between two families or between uncle and the father or even the neighbors. So it goes to the criminal code, it goes to the police, but essentially the dispute is with land. Now this has been also studied in some states, particularly Andhra Pradesh, where they found the very high percentage of criminal, so-called criminal cases are essentially land cases. So those are issues that we are. Now why did I take this longer view is to argue that it is important for us to understand why at all we are governing land. And we are not governing land historically for the same reason in different periods of history. So, taking forward this one is the question. The question is, what is going to be, and this is where I bring back my first slide, which was that we are changing the world in 10,000 to geological time scale, but we are not able to think beyond on an average 30, 40 years. So, including me, it's not that I'm able to think more than yours at all. So what is going to be the guiding principle of governance in next 150 to 200 years? That's the question. There is two possible answers at least, or maybe more, but I thought at least two. One is the business as usual, what we call the plan A. The plan A is to govern land for maximizing capital and market. And I'm calling it a capital paradigm. Most of the discussions that we do is about unleashing the power of the market, whether it is leasing reform, whether it is 10-year security, whether it is credit systems or anything that is related to this. We essentially do this, except for the fact, and this is surprising and this is a bit puzzling for all of us, because when we talk about commons and we talk about customary tenure, we talk about ecology, we talk about biodiversity, we talk about culture, we talk about hydrology. But when we talk about 80% of the land, which is today all agriculture, we don't talk about ecology, we talk about private property rights. Now that's a puzzle. That's the puzzle I was hearing even yesterday and today as well. In the morning we're having a customary rights session. The other thing could be to start thinking of, and this is what I said, that it's actually a proposal for future and an attempt to make a proposal, not a proposal at all, of about a new land governance paradigm. The paradigm is not about how to govern land, the paradigm is why govern land. So, I want to go to a few things here which are more about information to give you a little bit of the longer future context, The population is going to be around 11.5 to 11.7 billion in around 2100 to 2150. That's about 100 years from now, 120, 30 years from now. It's not 200 years still, see? Even though I'm saying, still, it's not about that. We are talking of private property rights of all the adult population, which will be around 7 billion of this population. And we're talking of each individual property rights of men and women both. So one possibility or track of thought, which I call the plan A, is this, that we shall, unfortunately UN is thinking 15 years until 2030. But let's say that, okay, if that continues, then we shall be able to achieve individual property rights, secure, stable, intergenerational, and free transactional, with free transactional value for nearly 7 to 7 billion people, 7.5 billion people. However, this is the one of the dangers. There's already a desertification taking place at our backyard, and most of the desertification that has taken place is in last 100 and 150 years, not even 300 years. The average figure of the world, this is UN figure again, it shows that it's already affected 300 million people, a billion as on today. This second bullet is on today, not in 2150. So if we do the plan A, which is essentially giving private property rights and allow everyone to do whatever they want to do with individual infinite freedom and individual liberty, and to bring in capability, the calculation can be made to show that it will be going to more than 2.5 billion people affected. Already about 25% of China's land is half deserted. And China's development, so-called development, is only 35 years old. So desertification is one. I want to put the another one, which is this planetary boundary. For those who may not be familiar with this thing called planetary boundary, I'm sure many of you are aware of it, so I'll take just 1 minute to explain that. In 2009, there is one of the most celebrated papers of this century so far, is that 26 scientists came together and huge algorithmic calculations they made and finally found that there is a operating space within which humanity can operate. And if we cross those boundaries, they named these planetary boundaries, we will not be safe. And they created 9 planetary boundaries, out of which we have already crossed 4. We are about to cross 2 more, and some are not. And there's a detailed paper in the Nature, and that's now getting referred to everywhere. It's called the Rockstrom paper. That says the cropland boundary is about 15%, and it's already 11.7%. This is 2008. 8 years have gone by. Project it to 11.5 billion people for 150 years ahead. And the before industrial use, the cropland percentage was below, around just, it was low, it was somewhere around 6% or so. So it is in that range it has grown. And by the way, I'm sure most of you know this, that the cropland doesn't only mean the crop directly for food grains of human beings. The cropland also refers to the land for which fodder is grown commercially for the animals which human beings finally will eat. Either that is beef or that is goat. There are countries like Denmark where the population is 5 million, or I'm not sure exactly, 5 million, maybe 7 million, but the population of pigs is 25 million. The same is in New Zealand. The population of animals is nearly 5 times the population of people. So people claim that when we talk demography, we should be talking equally about humans and those animals, because otherwise the country doesn't exist. Because the Danish people will need meat every day. So that's the another one. And if you look at land conflicts and the nature of land conflicts for last 100, 150 years, population growth, capital growth, land conflicts between states, between state and the community, between companies and community, and between communities. Those are already visible and rising in 3/4 of the world. There are maps nowadays people are trying to generate where land conflicts are happening. And there's already a land for India, and then there's a map for India, but I couldn't get a world map, so I didn't use the map. And if we have to say that we have to ensure private property rights for all the adults in 2150, I'm claiming that the number of land conflicts between states and nations, between communities, between companies and all, will be at least tenfolds. That's a estimate, a very rough estimates that can be made from the kind of projections that we already have. Biodiversity loss, part of it is related to land, part of it is not. We know that the extinction rate is already hundreds per million per year. 300 years ago, it was 0.1 to 1. The planetary boundary's value is 10. So we've already crossed 10 times the planetary boundary for biodiversity loss. The biggest biodiversity loss, unfortunately, is not urban society. The biggest biodiversity loss is because of agriculture, commercial agriculture. Biggest biodiversity loss is for the croplands and the water bodies. And it's astonishing that for last 4,000 years, we are only eating about 9 plants, 9 to 10. Wheat was the first thing that we got domesticated. Paddy, maize, potato, and in some others, ragi, not ragi, the other one is barley. The total count is 9. The entire humanity eats only 9 plants. And you have another 4 or 5 for the animals. And those AFS people will know more about those figures than I do. The biodiversity loss is connected to agriculture expansion. So the question is private property and commodification driven land governance sustainable?
Sorry, I have to interrupt you.
Yeah, I'm almost done. Another 5 minutes?
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Oh, absolutely done. Yeah. So, well, I propose a different paradigm to look for another next 200 years. One is a movement from, a shift from economic or commercial or purely capital gain based, private gain maximization based land use to an ecologically sound land use. So the governance paradigm has to be not only on secure private property, but also on the what is the land use that the society can permit. And here I just gave a list of these boundaries. There's a climate change boundary, there's biodiversity loss, there is biogeochemical emissions called nitrogen, phosphorus, land use, oceans acidification, fresh water, ozone depletion, etc., out of which basically cropland, biodiversity loss, geochemical emissions, and a little bit of fresh water and all are directly connected to how we govern land. The second one I want to propose is a kind of social control on land use and to reduce market control on land use. This is the second part of the paradigm that I am proposing. Because in 150 years' time, if we leave in the same way that we left market to take care of the land use for the last 300 years, and here I make an ecological principle is that the land use to be based on the principles of commons and not the principles of market. Land to be used not as an economic resource, but as an ecological resource. Because that has to be in conformity with the first in any way. Can't be dealt with a private gain maximization principle. And ecological resource, there are basic principles of ecological use, which is the 4 R's, reduce, recycle, and all that. I don't want to go into that because that will take my time. And this is what I thought will address some of Meenakshi Sundaramji's concern is about how to govern. A shared governance. And this is known that when we talk of local governance, even in India and many other places, what we don't often try to convey is that what exactly are we governing? If the world's basic economic productive resources and the resources that generates power, both kind of power, the electrical power and the social power, whether it is technology, whether it is natural resource, whether it is capital, whether it is materials, if we don't govern those, then, and those are governed by world, those are governed to be decided only in Washington DC, New York or California, or in Delhi or Lucknow. In the morning I was here in Delhi and Lucknow, I was so delighted. Then what the heck are we governing at local level? Are we governing only rights, or are we governing only NREGA, or are we governing what the state is going to give? So this is where the fallacy lies. What are we really governing? If we have to govern, when we say local governance or a shared governance, we are governing what we call resources for future. Now that's where a different kind of governance paradigm has to happen, because if the basic technology, capital, material, mining, mines, and all that is governed globally, finance, then you're not really governing anything in the local scenario, except some attempt which the state is giving you. So that's where this is the attempt to propose something. Now we know that there have been some good progresses in this country, and I think in some cases we are really thinking in the future. And I think as a community of land related practitioners and academics, we should be happy about it, that we are really in the right directions. But there are battles. The story of the battles and the wars we have been hearing right from yesterday and today. I don't want to go into these different things, but in our country we still do not, we accept 3 kinds of persons. One is the individual person like you and me. One is the institutional person like the India International Center, and one is called the religious person. And religious person is not a person who believes in religion. Religious person is the 33 crore gods. But we don't recognize in our law. Yes, because that is why you can file an FIR on behalf of Ma Durga. In this country, you can file an FIR on behalf of any god. But you cannot file an FIR on behalf of Ganges, because we do not recognize nature as a person. In some countries, in Latin America in particular, in New Zealand, they have done much more. There's something called rights of nature, and they have done how to really operationalize that is a big challenge in those countries as well. And we discussed about this. So that brings to my, essentially my end of my talk. The reason when I say but is that some of these and quite a few of these are addressing the second and the third, which is the social control and the shared governance. But it is still not bringing forth the first one, which is a movement from a pure commerce and economics based use to an ecological land use. Thank you. Thank you so much.
That was a good presentation.